Okay, it looks like many of you have had an opportunity to log in, so let's go ahead and start. Hello, members, board of directors, council, cabinet, educators, students, and guests. And welcome to the program today with David Firestein, the President and Chief Executive Officer at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. I'm Marianne Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Our conversation today centers on the world's two largest economies. As the U.S. Consulate in Chengdu was closed on Monday, following the closure of China Consulate General in Houston, and the relations between the U.S. and China have plunged to their worst point in many years. And they're over a variety of issues, ranking from trade and cybersecurity to the pandemic and China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to tell you about some of our newly scheduled programs. Our upcoming dialogues are going to cover many important issues, including American refugees, the suppression of Hong Kong's autonomy, the impacts of COVID-19 on Houston's energy industry, a discussion on America's political system with former Secretary of Labor Bob Reich, and our Jones Award program with commentary from the Secretary of Energy, Dan Brule. So be sure to visit our website at wachhouston.org to stay connected and engaged. Today's conversation, our guest is David Firestein. And David leads an organization that is very familiar to Houston and to the council members. The Bush China Foundation promotes the view that the U.S. China relationship is the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world, and that a constructive relationship between these two countries serves a vital interest of the U.S., as well as interests of China and the entire global community. The foundation supports the belief that virtually no major global challenge today can be resolved in an enduring sense in the absence of effective communication and cooperation between the US and China. David Firestein is the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations and a member of the foundation's board of directors. Prior to this, he was the inaugural executive director of the University of Texas at Austin's China Public Policy Center and a clinical professor at UT's Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, where he led UT's institutional engagement with China and oversaw interdisciplinary research on China-related domestic and foreign policy topics. Before joining UT, Mr. Firestein served as Senior Vice President and Perot Fellow at the East-West Institute. A decorated career U.S. diplomat, he is the co-author of 3 books on China, including 2 Chinese language bestsellers. And throughout his career, he has played an active role in advancing U.S. China and U.S. Asia trade, including Capitol Hill testimony on a range of topics, and was also a principal architect of the U.S. China high-level political party leaders dialogue. A native of Austin, he holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, whose dean we just hosted to a program yesterday. And he has 2 master's degrees from the University of Texas. Please welcome to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, Mr. David Firestein. David, welcome.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's really an honor to be with you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Well, we're so glad that you've joined us this evening, and there are so many people who are very inquisitive about what's happening with China, with some of our friends here locally. We have had great relationships with not only friends in our Chinese community, but also with the foundation. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us to learn more about this important relationship. So let's just dive in. Given the recent closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston and our U.S. consulate in Chengdu, and Secretary of State Pompeo's speech entitled "The Communist China and the Free World's Future," declaring the failure of 50 years of engagement with China, and the call for free societies to stand up to Beijing, I'd be interested for you to describe the state of today's U.S.-China relationship from your perspective.
Well, Marianne, thanks so much. And again, just let me start by saying thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be with you. I'm a big fan of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and I only wish we could all be together in person. And I'm grateful for the time of everyone who's taking the time to be a part of this event. To your question, yes, I think we are unquestionably at a modern era low point in the U.S.-China relationship, no doubt about it. I think literally as we sit here, all of us, nearly 200 of us on this call, this is the low ebb mark of the relationship, dating back to the 1970s. Things are bad and getting worse, seemingly almost daily. The closure of the Chinese Consulate General in Houston, and then the reciprocal and predictable closure of the U.S. Consulate General in Chengdu, I think mark a new low point. It's something, the closure of a Consulate General is something that is unprecedented in U.S.-China relations since normalization in 1979. Indeed, the Houston Consulate, as I think is widely known there in Houston, was the first consulate established by the People's Republic of China in the United States. So there's particular symbolism around the closure of this particular consulate general. And I think, the relationship is definitely in a bad place. I think prospects in the near term for U.S.-China relations are pretty bleak. But as I've said before, just because we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel doesn't mean we shouldn't keep marching forward toward the end of the tunnel. And that's what we hope to do at the Bush-China Foundation.
You mentioned this is unprecedented, the closure of one consulate, the closure of another. Has this ever happened before in recent years?
The only time I can think of that a consulate or a diplomatic mission might be closed is when two countries are either at war, literally engaging in warfare with each other, or on the cusp of doing so. But during a time of peace, for a nation to simply close down another nation's consulate general or any part of its diplomatic mission is, as far as I am aware, pretty well unprecedented in the modern era. I just haven't heard of another case of this happening. Even if the United States government, for example, were to have come to the judgment, as it evidently did, that the Chinese Consulate General in Houston were engaging in actions and activities that were detrimental to the interests of the United States, a more traditional response under any U.S. president in the past would have been to declare persona non grata, or PNG, any number of diplomatic personnel, as, for example, President George W. Bush did during my time as a U.S. diplomat in Moscow, and the United States evicted or expelled, rather, 50 Russian diplomats. And of course, predictably, the next day, the Russians expelled 50 U.S. diplomats as a reciprocal and kind of tit-for-tat measure. That is not unheard of, although that particular case was rather dramatic. But to expel one person, 2, 5, some number of individuals is not unheard of. To close down an entire mission on 72 hours notice is unprecedented. And it's a sign of just how dramatically the U.S.-China relationship has deteriorated. And of course, China took a countervailing response, closed our consulate general in Chengdu. And I have to say, I have been wondering whether this might be an indication that the Trump administration seeks to move in the direction of de-recognizing the People's Republic of China. I'm not saying that I believe that will happen. I'm not saying that I predict that'll happen, but it certainly would have been unthinkable even months ago, or certainly 3 years ago. Now I don't think it is so unthinkable. And if one were to want to de-recognize a country and terminate diplomatic relations with another country, closing one of its consulates would be a good place to start. And I think it's a stark indication of where things are right now.
Would you say that that's the Trump administration and maybe Washington's viewpoint, that at this point, the next steps would be what, do you think?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it's really hard to predict with this president. Any given moment, any of us can look down at a cell phone and see a tweet and see a fundamental change in U.S. policy or an unexpected presidential or U.S. government initiative. I think things will get worse substantively and tonally in the relationship between now and the U.S. presidential election in early November. Obviously, China is an issue, in a sense, in the U.S. Presidential election, not because the two parties at this point in time have any substantive disagreement about how the United States should engage China, but because, in a sense, they appear to be competing with each other to out-tough each other on the way to what each party hopes will be a win in November. And so things are going to get worse before they get worse. And they're certainly going to get worse before they get better. What the specific next thing that could happen might be, honestly, I've given up trying to predict, because I think we are in some really uncharted territory at this time.
So you don't really see any partisan divide in Washington as to the viewpoints of China?
Yeah, it's a good question. In short, no. I think both parties are really more or less in the same place. Both parties are now framing China to a certain degree as certainly an adversary, certainly a rival, in most cases an adversary, and I think in many cases people are actually invoking the terminology of enemy to describe China. And I think that is across party lines. We've seen a number of different cases in which U.S. legislation in both houses of Congress have passed, not only with bipartisan support, but in a surprising number of cases with unanimous support. Literally 535 elected members of the United States Congress have voted in favor of any number of pieces of legislation relating to China. And obviously, that demonstrates an extraordinary level of, if you will, bipartisanship or bipartisan consensus. I will say, with that being said, that I do continue to detect a significant difference between the two parties when it comes to the kind of language that is being used, the tonality, the rhetoric itself, the tonality of the rhetoric. You much more often will hear prominent Republicans, certainly in the executive branch, but also in the legislative branch, and in particular in the United States Senate, articulating much tougher rhetoric on China, and with a tougher tonality than you typically hear from Democrats. I think that is a fair point to make. I'd be hard pressed to name a prominent Democrat that has made China his or her issue per se, in the way that probably half a dozen Senate Republicans have, and others as well. So I think there is a partisan divide in terms of the degree of willingness to be vocal about China, to use a certain type of tonality, and frankly, if I may observe, to fundraise politically off of China. I see all kinds of messages from Republican senators going out to constituents asking for money so that that individual, the senator, can get tough on China. I don't see many of those kinds of communications going out from Democrats. So I think there are some differences around those types of issues. But that said, when it comes to the substance of how official Washington sees China, I think there is a very high degree of unanimity If I may add, Marianne, let me just also say that I think part of it is that there is a different view about China that is prevalent in Washington today than there was under any previous administration, any previous Congress. But the other part of it that I think, if we're being intellectually honest, we have to recognize is that people that may not feel quite the way some of the most prominent hardline folks feel are probably not feeling very comfortable expressing more moderate views in the political climate that we have in this country, where the expression of a relatively moderate view on China, a view similar to the views of George H.W. Bush, for example, would typically be seen as something that could be very politically risky in Washington today. And I think that bandwagon effect and frankly, a kind of McCarthyist sentiment that we see in this country now relative to China is also skewing the terms of the debate in ways that are not insignificant.
Somewhat related to that, with the Trump administration, how accurate do you think their fundamental assumptions, strategic assumptions are towards China?
It's a great question, Marianne. Let me say this. I think, to answer your question directly, I think the Trump administration is wrong in a couple of its most basic assumptions about Chinese strategic intentions. And I think because the administration is wrong in those assumptions, policy is veering off course, because when you have a policy that is predicated in an inaccurate understanding of the object of your policy is likely to do something other than what you were hoping it would do. The two specific things I would say, and I might even add a third, but the two big ones are, I think this administration believes and has said that it believes that China is seeking to remake the world in its image. And that, if you will, China is seeking to make the world safe for authoritarianism, as we might put it. China is actively going out trying to create, if you will, little Chinas or replicas of its own system across the globe. The second assumption that I think the Trump administration is clearly making and has talked about publicly is that it believes that China seeks to supplant and replace the United States as the world's only superpower, as we in America define the term superpower. I think both of those understandings of China are absolutely dead wrong. Both of them are erroneous. China does a lot of things that are very problematic for the United States. No question about that. And they do things that are problematic in the eyes of many in the world. By the way, we also do things that are very problematic from China's standpoint. But speaking from an American perspective, I would never whitewash some of China's actions. But to say that China has those two particular strategic ambitions and intentions, I think, is a misreading of China, a profound misreading of China. There is a third element to this that I think needs to be noted. And let me just say, just to elaborate on this particular point. So what does China want if it doesn't want those things? I think China wants to make the world safe, not for authoritarianism generally, but for itself. China is an authoritarian nation. It is a one-party state. It wants to remain a one-party state. It seeks to perpetuate its regime type indefinitely. And that's what it intends to do. But it doesn't care whether, and nor does it particularly seek to have other countries emulate its system. I think many in America would like to see China become a Jeffersonian democracy. But no one in China wants to see America become a one-party communist dictatorship. So there's a fallacy in the thinking there. With respect to the notion of unipolarity or U.S. superpowerdom, I think it's fair to say China wants to be a more co-equal player in the world in a more multipolar setting, and in relative terms would like to see the differential of power between the United States on the one hand and China on the other reduced, so that the US is not so much vastly more powerful than China than it is at present. That certainly is a goal. But I can say for sure, China doesn't want to be a second United States bumping us off and taking our place as the world policeman and the country that puts boots on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq and Grenada and Panama and the Gulf and so forth and so on. It has no ambitions in that area, partly because it sees the costliness of those policies in terms of human life and in terms of national treasure. So China wants to do a lot of things. Some of the things China wants to do are immensely problematic for our nation, but it doesn't want to do the things that the Trump administration thinks it wants to do. And when your policy is predicated in flawed premises, it's going to end up not doing what you're hoping that it would do. The final point I would quickly make is that I think there is a sense in the Trump administration that somehow there is the Communist Party of China on the one hand, and Marianne, you referenced the talk given by Secretary of State Pompeo recently, which mentions the Communist Party by name. And then somehow there's the people on the other. And the two are completely at odds with each other in this narrative, in the Pompeo view, the Trump view. You know, when a country is dealing with external pressures in any country, whether the United States or whether China or others, there tends to be a dynamic in which people rally around their national leadership, rally around the flag, and want to stand together to deal with external challenges, external pressures, and external threats. 9/11 brought that moment in a way that we all vividly remember to our nation, where we rallied around our leader, we rallied around our government, and we rallied around the cause of defeating global terrorism. We, as a nation, the United States, are now putting such pressure on China that I think what we're seeing is that the people in China are increasingly rallying around their government in just exactly the same way that we would rally around our government if a country were constantly telling us that we were its enemy. And so here, as with other elements of the Trump administration's policy toward China, you actually see kind of the reverse effect of what is desired. The more pressure, the more, let me put it this way, the more we use an adversarial tonality and language to describe China, the more we are pushing the Chinese people to rally around their own leadership. And I don't know that that's in the interests of the United States. So these are the ways in which I think the Trump administration at the big picture level is really just fundamentally misreading China. They're reading China correctly in certain regards, and they've in some ways correctly diagnosed the problem. I just really disagree with the prescription for the problem, and that's where I think there is a legitimate policy debate to be had.
You talked about the tonality, and so I'm going to ask you the question, what impact has COVID-19, the pandemic, had on the escalation of tensions in the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, it's a great question. And in short, COVID-19, I think, has had a very profound impact on how the United States thinks about China, how the United States frames China. Things were pretty bad from the period of January 2017, when President Trump took office, to the early part of this year. But COVID-19 has taken things to a qualitatively different level. The way I would explain it is, and the impact has been on US government thinking, but also on US public sentiment. It has been a long, long time since anyone in the United States has seriously alleged that China has taken American life. You'd really have to go back, certainly, to the Korean War, and one arguably could go back to the Vietnam War, but certainly the Korean War, where there was direct conflict between US forces and Chinese forces, and one could say Chinese military forces have taken American life. Subsequent to that, whatever conflicts and disagreements we've had have generally been political disagreements. But with COVID-19, a narrative emerged in this country that many believe is an accurate representation of events, that somehow China, in this view, unleashed COVID-19 willfully on the United States in an effort to hurt us, to take American life and to hurt American livelihoods and hurt the American economy. I don't believe that is true, and many people in this country, I think, reject that narrative, but many people embrace it. And if you think that that a country has unleashed a pandemic upon you, a plague upon your nation to kill you and to take away your livelihoods and put a huge dent in your economy, then you're going to have a certain mindset about that country if that is your assumption. I think a lot of people embrace that narrative, and that's why we have seen a very significant deterioration in U.S. sentiment toward China in the specific wake of COVID-19 unfolding for our nation, basically starting in February. Ultimately, the issue goes back, I think, to December or November of last year, but it started coming into our orbit in February. And since that time, we've seen a 25% drop in U.S. favorable sentiment toward China. So there's no question at all, Marianne, that COVID-19 has had a very profound impact on how the U.S. government frames China and how the U.S. public sees China.
Yes, it has seeped into public perceptions, and so it's amazing how we have interpreted that and shifted so dramatically in such a short time. Back to Secretary of State Pompeo's tough speech on China. He said the U.S. policy of engagement toward China is a failed policy. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
No, I don't. I think it's an absurd assessment to say that the United States has not gained from engaging with China since President Nixon made his historic visit to China in 1972 is absurd on its face. It's absolutely not the case that we have not benefited. We've benefited in a lot of different ways. We benefited geopolitically in the 1970s by working with China in various ways, and the 1980s against the Soviet Union and some of the things that it was doing, which was one of the principal reasons for Nixon's decision to engage China in the first place. Needless to say, our economy has blossomed over the last 50 years in terms of virtually every metric that you can apply: GDP growth, stock market, et cetera. And China has been a big part of that story. It's in so many different ways on geopolitical issues, security issues, economic issues, economic life for average Americans, job creation in the United States, and for that matter, 401k portfolios in the stock market. In almost every way that you can count, the United States has benefited from our engagement with China, our trade with China, our engagement with China as a diplomatic partner on tough issues. We've often had, not always, but often had China's support in the United Nations when we have sought it, including in terms of the Gulf Wars back in the 1990s, and on many other issues, North Korea and other issues. To literally dismiss that and simply say that all of this it counts for nothing over the last 50 years, I think is an erroneous and absurd assessment that is grounded in ideology rather than in the factual record. So no, I strongly disagree with the notion that engagement represents a failed policy. I will say there have been, and I've said for years, and I'm on the public record for years saying, there have been massive asymmetries in the relationship between the United States and China in many different areas, economic and trade areas in particular, but also even with respect to just things like when an American goes to China, if that American is a Gmail user, they can't use Gmail because Gmail is locked out. If that American is a New York Times online reader, that American's not going to be able to read the New York Times in China. That's unfortunate and wrong. When a Chinese person comes to this country, he or she can use a Chinese internet platform. They can read the China Daily or Xinhua News or any other Chinese publication because we protect those freedoms, freedom of the press, freedom of information, and so on. So there have been asymmetries, no question about that. The asymmetries need to be rectified, no question about that. But to simply say that engagement has been a failed policy is an indefensible position, I think, by any objective measure.
Going to take one of my own questions and bring in one of our audience questions. So Hong Kong has been a very serious issue in U.S. China relations. Christopher asks, do you think that the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong will be closed?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Let me say this. There are already instances in which offices have left Hong Kong because the decision makers relative to those offices have come to the belief that they would no longer be able to safely operate in Hong Kong owing to the implementation of this new Hong Kong national security legislation, national security law that was put into place about a month ago, and it was promulgated early this month, early July. One example is the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Office, which is the quasi-consulate, if you will. It's not a consulate, but a quasi-consulate equivalent in Hong Kong, made the decision to leave Hong Kong because under the terms of the Hong Kong national security law, for TECO, TECO, the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Office, to simply articulate its positions would effectively become a violation in all likelihood of the law. Therefore, they made the decision to leave. So the question is a very good one. The difference, I think, is, to the question directly, I don't think the U.S. will be forced to close or will choose to close its consulate general in Hong Kong. I certainly hope we don't do that or don't have to do that. U.S. diplomatic personnel in Hong Kong enjoy diplomatic immunity, and therefore they can say and do the things they need to say and do pursuant to advancing our nation's interests, and be free of prosecution because they enjoy diplomatic status and therefore diplomatic immunity. But it is not an unreasonable question. And given how bad things are and given other consulate closures, I wouldn't rule anything out. But I don't think that has to happen because of the principle of diplomatic immunity. However, Americans and others who are in Hong Kong who don't have diplomatic immunity are going to have to engage in a set of calculations and decision making that takes into account the fact that the risk level for them, if they're outspoken about political matters that are deemed sensitive by the powers that be there, the risk level has increased greatly. And I'll be honest, I have serious concerns about, like many, about this new law in a number of different ways. The vagueness of the definitions is a fundamental issue. The rescinding of what we would call in America the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, which has now been taken away from people in Hong Kong on matters relative to national security. I think that's a very serious problem. And also the extraordinary extraterritorial jurisdictional reach of the law, I think is very problematic and frankly shocking to me that China would allow this type of language to be in the law, namely language that potentially creates criminal liability for every person on the planet Earth if they do certain things relative to the national security situation in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. That type of effort to extend a jurisdictional reach across the globe is something that I think is quite shocking and audacious. I'm surprised that China would seek to do that. And that and the other things that I mentioned in any number of other areas all caused me major concern about this law and fundamentally what the impact of the law is going to be on Hong Kong's ability to continue to serve as the pearl of Asia and a massively important economic and financial center in the world. And by the way, a massively important U.S. trading partner. Let me say, Marianne, one other thing that's important about Hong Kong. As with other policies, the Trump administration has reacted, but a good portion of our policy toward Hong Kong is likely to hurt America first and hurt America worst. What do I mean by that? I mean that it sounds to me like the Trump administration is planning to eliminate preferential treatment for Hong Kong on the issue of tariffs. If that is what happens, then what we're doing is we're hurting the people of Hong Kong and we're hurting ourselves by making it more difficult for Hong Kong producers to sell to us and inevitably making it more difficult when China countervails with its tariffs for us to sell to Hong Kong. We have a surplus with Hong Kong. Under President Trump's policies, that surplus may go away very quickly. And the analogy I would use is if one spouse commits abuse against another spouse and someone calls the police and the police come and arrest the spouse who was abused, that's what we're doing. We're punishing the people of Hong Kong and we're punishing ourselves in terms of some of the policies of the Trump administration relative to Hong Kong. Should we do something? Yes. Should we hurt good people of Hong Kong and hurt the good people of the United States of America? I sure as heck don't think we should, but evidently the Trump administration does.
Brings me to another thought and question concerning human rights and civil liberties with China. Are such measures likely to have impact on China's goals and policies? And there's a whole hour-long conversation around this, but maybe you can give us your assessment of on human rights and civil liberties.
Well, human rights are very important. When I was a U.S. diplomat for 18 years, one of the things that I did at one point in my career over a period of years was draft significant sections of the United States Human Rights Report. I care a lot about human rights. It's part of who we are as a nation, standing strong for our values and for our constitutional principles. And I think the United States should always speak out on human rights where we feel that is necessary, and we should continue to do that. I have said publicly before that and more than once, I think China's record on human rights is very poor. I think some deplorable things occur there, and there are any number of details we could drill down into. However, the point that I would make here in reference to your question is, one of the things that I think is very clear is that the ability of the United States to fundamentally change the human rights picture in China is very minimal. Whether we like that fact or not, that is self-evidently the case. One thing we should point out is under President Trump, who has fashioned himself as the toughest U.S. president on China, and many people in the United States who are knowledgeable, Republicans and Democrats, who are knowledgeable about the U.S. China relationship would actually say President Trump has been the weakest U.S. president on China in America's history. But President Trump fancies himself to be the toughest. It's on President Trump's watch that China has engaged in human rights abuses relative to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang on the scale that they have. It wasn't on President Obama's watch, it was on President Trump's watch. That's a good indicator of the disconnect between U.S., quote, toughness and U.S. policy on the one hand and Chinese actions on the other. Even when you have a purportedly tough president, China is going to do what it's going to do, and our ability to influence that is very minimal. Doesn't mean we shouldn't express our values and stand up for our values and speak out and call out bad behavior. By the way, a lot of nations are calling out U.S. behavior in many different regards. And one of the things that I've been most saddened by in recent years is the decline in U.S. Moral credibility to speak on these issues. Marianne, let me ask you this question rhetorically. How do we as Americans stand up for freedom of the press in China when we have a president who has referred to the American media as enemies of the people? How do we make that argument to China or Russia or any other country when our own president refers repeatedly to our media as the enemy of the people or enemies of the people? That doesn't help us make our case. But to your point, we need to speak out. We need to address issues where we can. If we can make a difference, let's try. But for the most part, whether we like it or not, China is going to do what it sees fit to do. A lot of those things will be objectionable to us, and we'll have to react as we see fit. But I would argue that we ought to react in ways that take into account America's interest, not ideology and not emotional and reflexive reactions. We need to keep our eyes on the prize, the long-term national security interests of the United States of America. Something, by the way, that I think President George H.W. Bush did tremendously well, as have other presidents in the past.
Do you think a change from Trump to Biden would impact U.S.-Chinese relations? Ken, one of our members, asked.
It's a great question. I think the short answer is, in some ways, yes. But I think that the trajectory that we're on as a nation in our policy and posture toward China is now very deeply entrenched in official Washington, in the agencies, in the executive branch, and certainly in the United States Congress. I don't think that even if Joe Biden were to win the presidency and become president in January of next year, I don't think we would see a dramatic shift in U.S. policy toward China. Much of the Trump administration's thinking about China has now been institutionalized and codified in law. As a matter of practical politics and policy, it's going to be very difficult to undo most of that at all, but certainly with any speed. I do think what will change is that we'll have a different style of presidential communication, a more conventional style of presidential communication. I think we'll have a president that talks about world affairs in ways that are somewhat more recognizable relative to past U.S. presidents of both parties. I think we will have a slightly different tonality, perhaps a somewhat more measured tonality. Some particular policies may change, but I think the broad contours of U.S. policy toward China will not shift dramatically or quickly unless and until China makes some changes in the way that it deals with the United States. I do think that the Trump administration's goal of seeking greater reciprocity in America's relationship with China is appropriate. It is an appropriate goal for the United States to want that. My objection to, or my disagreement with the Trump administration's policies generally, and I agree with certain things that the administration has done and not with others, but my general critique is that it's not that the problem has been misdiagnosed, it's that the wrong medicine has been prescribed. And of course, if I may say so, that's why under this president, we have the largest merchandise deficit with China we've ever had. We have the largest average annual merchandise deficit across the entire term of office that we've ever had in American history. We have had the largest two U.S. merchandise deficits with the world, annual merchandise deficits with the world, in the recorded history of the United States, dating back to July 4th, 1776. We are losing manufacturing jobs, and the cost of goods at Walmart and Target and across the nation are greater than they were 2 years ago for all of us. If that's this president's definition of winning, then he's right. I am tired of winning.
So I have a couple of questions, and I want to make sure we address this because this is very important, especially for the Houston community. We have a large medical institutional community here. We have the world's largest energy related company presence here in Houston. Questions around the procurement of intellectual property, the Chinese growing superiority in AI and 5G, when to trust, when to distrust, how are they procuring this? Maybe you could give us a sense of what you have awareness of.
Well, there are a lot of different things there, Marianne. It's a great question. Let me just say this. China is the most formidable national competitor that the United States has or will have for the lifetimes of every American that is drawing breath today. So an infant just born moments ago in Houston, in the lifetime of that infant, China will be the most formidable national competitor that we will ever have. No question about that. They are competing with us in high tech, in AI, in quantum physics, in 5G, all the areas that you mentioned. I think this administration has philosophically said, how can we make our competitor less competitive, rather than saying, how can we make ourselves more competitive? And it is certainly true, and I've said for years, that China has at times gamed the system. It has at times done things that are improper, I think unlawful under U.S. law, inappropriate, illegal, detrimental to U.S. interests. No question about that. I absolutely have seen that. And all of that is true. But the thing that I try to point out to my friends who were still in government, and I was in U.S. government for 18 years, is the only thing we can really control is our performance. And so I think the answer to intense competition is what it always has been in our nation, and that is upping our game. You know, when the Soviets back in the 50s or 60s were competing with us in terms of the space race and missiles, we didn't say, let's make it harder for them to succeed. We said, let's up our game and let's get to a point where we can beat them at this game. I think that's the mindset that we need to bring to this. I'll mention someone who is a recent resident of Houston, unfortunately recently passed away, a gentleman who is a very dear friend and someone I respect immensely, Dan Slane, who was a very strong China hawk, former chairman of the U.S. Economic and Security Review Commission, longtime Republican, hardliner on China, and someone that I learned a lot from and greatly respected. And he said to me, after a trip to China, he said, David, I have seen the enemy, and it is us. And I couldn't agree more with Dan Slane, of blessed memory. He passed away a couple of months ago. But he's exactly right. If we're going to win in the competition with China, as I hope and believe we will, we need to up our game and worry less about them and worry more about getting our own house in order and doing the things that we need to do and making the investments in the future and in these high-tech areas, et cetera. It is also true that we need to speak out when we think China is breaking the rules that it has signed up to abide by in terms of the World Trade Organization, the trading system, and so on. Absolutely, we should take a strong stand on that. We should call out illegal and improper actions or behavior on the part of China. But the only thing that we definitely can control is us. And I think we ought to spend more time focusing on that and less time focusing on the competitor that we think is in the rearview mirror who's gaining on us. And it makes me think of that Jurassic Park video or movie where it says, images in this mirror are larger than they appear. And we're looking in the mirror and we're seeing China. We need to be looking forward, and we need to be doing things that make our country stronger, faster, better. One of the things that has been most disappointing to me personally is that this administration is adopting some of China's worst practices as best practices to be emulated. We became the #1 power in the world's lone superpower, the only superpower left standing, the number one economy, the number one innovator, by doing things our way, by relying on the market, by relying on the principles of limited government, the notion that trade benefits all and increases the pie. I think it would be a big mistake strategically for us to veer away from those principles, because those are the principles that made this nation great to begin with.
Tatiana asked, what would happen if the U.S. tried to stop recognizing China?
Well, my job would get very interesting, even more interesting than it's been, and it's been quite interesting in the last year or so. It would be, it's hard to contemplate how profound a shift that would be. The hit to the U.S. economy would be profound, because presumably that would have a very serious impact on, obviously, trade between our two nations, our ability to advance important national security interests that are where we need China's support and help would be greatly undermined, whether it's North Korea, whether it's global, whether it's climate change, whether it's international piracy on the high seas, for example, off the coast of the Eastern Horn of Africa, whether it's pandemics, a whole range of issues. The implications would be profound. They would be far-reaching. They would be detrimental to the United States, in my judgment, and I think the judgment of every living former president, every living former Secretary of State, and every major thinker that has ever thought about these issues and spoken about them. It would be a kind of decoupling, if you will, to the extreme. And I think it would be really bad news for our country. It would take a while to lay out all the cascading implications of that. By the way, it would set back the U.S. economy. It would set back our growth model. It would set back our research and development, which relies heavily on immigration from abroad, including from China, not limited to China, but including from China. I think the Trump administration believes that all innovation that occurs in America occurs from the descendants of those who came over on the Mayflower. I've got news for the Trump administration. That's not the case, just factually. And the cascading impacts of full derecognition would be life-changing for all of us and for the world. And I think it would make the world a worse place, not a better place, and one where significant international conflict was likelier, not less likely. That's a summary, a short summary of it, I think.
I don't want to close out the conversation until we talk about trade. What is your perspective? What do you see going forward in the future?
Well, first of all, let me reiterate one important point. Look, we've had a trade war for over 2 years, a so-called trade war, that we, the United States, started essentially by imposing tariffs, and then China responded, and we went back and forth and did that. Now everything's more expensive for the American people, et cetera, as we all know. So even with the trade war, we still trade today, based on Trump administration data, about $550 billion worth of two-way trade between the United States and China. It's down from where it was a year or two ago, but it's still a colossal trading relationship that is third only to Canada and Mexico. So it's still a relationship that matters to the nation. And by the way, it's a relationship that matters to Texas. And I'm a native-born Texan. I'm from Austin originally. My mom and dad met and married in Houston. My 3 sisters were born there. My ties to Texas are very deep, and I care a lot about the state. Texas is the #1 exporter to China. We surpassed California just, I think, last year. So China matters to the Texas economy, particularly the energy sector, which we could do a standalone session on or talk briefly about. But China really matters. And even in the, quote, worst of times, we still have a robust top 3 trade relationship with China. My criticism of the Trump administration's trade policies is that they have done precisely the opposite of what President Trump said they were supposed to do. They were supposed to decrease the deficit with China. The deficit's up. They were supposed to decrease the deficit with the world. Our deficit with the world is at an all-time record. They were supposed to increase manufacturing jobs. We've lost them. They were supposed to make things better for Americans economically. We're all paying about $1,500 more at the store than we were 2 years ago, according to nonpartisan studies. By the way, all of the data I just cited is from the Trump administration. So my problem with the Trump administration's solution to the problem of trade is that the solution is worse than the problem. And people sometimes ask me, why couldn't President Obama or President George W. Bush or President Clinton or President George H.W. Bush or other US presidents solve the US deficit problem with China? And my short answer to that question is, I think it's because all of these presidents representing both parties, very smart, talented, and capable individuals who rose to the top office of our nation, none of them could think of a solution that wasn't worse than the problem. Well, the Trump administration has thought of a solution. The only problem is the solution is worse than the problem was. And that's why we have bigger deficits, fewer manufacturing jobs, and are paying more at Walmart and Target. So where are things going? I think sometimes the best solution is to recognize that you don't have the wisdom to come up with a better status quo than the current status quo. That's not been the case over the last couple of years. I hope things will level out, but the trade relationship will never be much better than the overall U.S.-China relationship. And if we as a nation wanted China to start chipping away at that merchandise deficit that we have with them, one of the ways to do it would have been not to pick a fight with the country that you're trying to get to buy more of your stuff. So again, it's just an example of working at cross purposes. Let me just mention one other quick point, because I know I don't want to blather on and take people's time. But let me make one important point that hits close to home for the great state of Texas, our beloved home state. Texas is, and Houston in particular, is the energy capital of the world. We all know that. We're all immensely proud of that. The United States ought to be selling boatloads of liquefied natural gas to China, and we could if we had a different mindset in Washington and we had a different set of policies. China wants it. We have it. They need it. Let's do it. It's a pretty simple idea. China has twice as much technically recoverable shale gas in terms of fracking as we do. They have 1.1 something trillion cubic feet so far identified of technically recoverable shale gas. Guess where that gas is? In the Sichuan Basin. Guess which U.S. Consulate General served that basin and helped American business get opportunities there? You got it. The U.S. Consulate General in Chengdu, which was just closed because we closed China's Consulate General in Houston. So it's just another example of not thinking through the second and third order impacts of these decisions and hurting our ability to, in the case of Texas, and I say it as a proud Texan here in Austin, to export massive quantities of liquefied natural gas to China, which they want and need. They're trying to double their natural gas use in the next several years from 7% of the current mix to 15% of energy use in China. It's a doubling. We ought to be benefiting from that, and we could if we had the right policy framework and if we had the notion of, if we embrace the notion of walking and chewing gum at the same time, which is not something that we currently embrace.
So lastly, James asks, what steps should we take to re-engage with China? And I'm going to ask you to weave that into what are the efforts that the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations are doing to foster better relationships with the country?
Well, thank you for that. And look, I think we need to be clear-eyed in engaging China. They do a good number of things that are very, very problematic for us as a nation. No question about that. I would never whitewash that. It's true. I've seen it up close and personal. It's a problem. But it is also true that China is, in fact, an indispensable partner of our nation in a variety of ways. I think philosophically what we have to do is be able to hold in our mind two truths that are seemingly contradictory, but that really aren't contradictory at the same time. And that is that China is our most formidable national competitor, bar none, and it is also an indispensable partner and a country without which we can never fully fulfill our potential as a nation. Both of those statements are true. China recognizes that. We need to recognize it as well so that we advance our interests. I don't think we should engage China because it's good for China. I think we should engage China because engaging China in a way that's thoughtful, in a way that's results oriented, in a way that's substantive, in a way that's clear-eyed is good for us. That's why we should do it. That's why President George H.W. Bush, that's what he believed. That's what all previous US presidents believed. And it leads me to make a quick point about our foundation. The George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations has a very simple mission: to advance U.S. China relations in ways that reflect the ethos, spirit, and values of President George H.W. Bush. President George H.W. Bush believed that the U.S. China relationship was the most important relationship in the world. President Bush said that he loved the Chinese people. President Bush knew more about China than any incoming president in American history because he had lived there. And he had literally spent countless hours with the people of China, and he brought those insights to his presidency. We believe, as President Bush did, President George H.W. Bush, that we need to be clear-eyed, we need to focus on results, we need to be pragmatic, not ideological, and we need to bring our nations together where possible to advance America's interests and to realize the full potential of our nation, which President Bush believed couldn't be done without engaging with China in a substantive way. That's our mandate, and we see ourselves as being in the sensible center of the debate. We have been very critical of Chinese policies on any number of occasions, and will continue to be where we think that's merited. But we don't want the baby thrown out with the bathwater. We believe that the first and second largest economies, the largest and second largest economies of the world, need to deal with each other, that these two immense powerhouses globally have to work together to solve global challenges, whether it's North Korea, whether it's climate change, whether it's pandemics, or any number of other issues. And we're going to continue to work to give expression to President George H.W. Bush's laudable vision for the relationship, a vision shared by every living former U.S. president and every major figure in foreign policy up until 2017.
David, thank you for joining us tonight. We so appreciate your insights on this very, very important relationship. It's complex, it's long-standing, it's so very important to our future in a multiple of different ways. We so appreciate your time this evening. I want to invite all of you who are watching to stay engaged with the World Affairs Council. We have programs every week. Next week, we'll be talking specifically around Hong Kong. I saw several questions regarding Hong Kong. And so make sure you join us for that, as well as a program on refugees in America. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, David, again. Everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, stay engaged, and stay connected. Good night.
Thank you so much.